The entire thing was way too small. I had to rip back the entire yoke. At that point, I wasn't really counting stitches in the pattern, really making a case for guessing. In today's episode, I wanted to address a question that I've gotten asked fairly frequently, and that is how I get my garments to fit me well. And I don't think my answer is going to be what most people expect. I have a very free-spirited approach to sweater modification, and I wanted to talk about it with all of you today because I think that while it might not be for everyone, there are some helpful ideas and bigger picture concepts that I find really important. And they're things that I find have been beneficial in not just my knitting, but pretty much in anything I've done in life. So what we're gonna do today is break this video into two key parts. I do wanna talk to you all about exactly how I modify sweaters. We're gonna be using my Telvinin sweater as a case study to walk through a lot of the ways that I like to modify. The second part of this video is really gonna be me explaining and talking about why I like to take this approach to modification. I don't like to actually do a ton of very specific math, and I think there is a skill to be had and value to be found in guessing. While it might not be for everyone, I think that it's worth talking about, and I would be curious to hear everyone's thoughts on this topic down below, because I don't often hear people talk about modification in this way, and so I'm curious what all y'all's thoughts are. If you're new here and don't know me, my name is Charlotte, also known as Everystitch.counts. I truly believe that there's nothing trivial in life, and no matter how small, everything counts towards something beautiful. And to me, there's nothing that represents that better than a sweater. I love to knit, and when I'm not doing that, I am girl bossing at my 9 to 5, taking care of my Australian Shepherd lady, and I'm also in the process of opening up a small business where I'm going to be selling handmade polymer clay stitch markers and progress keepers and other knitting notions. If you want to be notified about that when I officially open, the link is in the description. If you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe, comment on the video. I would love to have you along. Before I get into the bulk of this video, I just want to give a couple of disclaimers for people listening. Number one, I am just a knitter just like you. This is just how I like to work and the process that I have found works best for me. And I think this is the way that I get the most out of my knitting, both skill-wise and outcome-wise. Number two, there is more than one way to modify something. The math behind the knitting is pretty much consistent throughout all modification videos, but the way that you apply that to your knitting and the ways that you might modify something and the exact stitch or method that you use could be different from person to person. So much of it is not bound by rules, and so again, these are just how I like to do it. Number three, this video is also not a how-to per se. This is definitely just me explaining to you what I like to do and what works for me. As far as specific how-to videos, I have personally listened to lots of different resources on this that I think are way better at explaining the technical part of modification, and I have linked all of those resources that I like down below. Speaking of resources, this is the perfect time to introduce the sponsor of today's video, Craftsy. Craftsy is an online community and resource for all things creative. Think handmade. They have classes that range from knitting and crochet, all things fiber arts, to sewing, to baking and cooking, to traditional art, and there's truly something for everybody. All of Craftsy's classes are taught through instructional videos that are led by friendly, professional experts within their field. All of these classes give step-by-step visual instructions and how-tos while being able to provide the instructor's personal experience and tips and tricks for you to utilize in your own crafts and your own art along the way. They're always adding new classes and content and ways for their community to learn and engage in whatever craft or art that they're most excited about. One of my favorite things about this community is how much they prioritize connection. You can connect with the instructors themselves and engage with them and ask them questions, as well as other community members. This is a great way to connect with others who are interested in the same thing, ask questions, ask for other experiences, and tackle maybe some problems that that you're facing in your own personal creative work. This, I think, is what really brings the joy of these arts to life, is that human to human connection with other people who understand deeply the joy that it brings us. I've been enjoying looking at lots of different classes on Craftsy, but my favorites so far have been Intarsia, Basics and Beyond, as I'm prepping for my first Intarsia project, as well as all of the painting classes. I really am enjoying learning about color theory and color combinations because I think it's one of those sub-skills that's really important when it comes to fiber arts, and I'm enjoying bolstering that in myself a little bit. As a member of Craftsy, you'll get access to the classes as well as live streaming tutorials led by instructors. During these live streams, you can ask questions, they'll share tips, and you can engage with the instructors real time for real time feedback. If any of this is sounding like it's your jam and you're interested in checking Craftsy out, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a full year of premium Craftsy membership for only $1.49. Yes, that's $1.49 for a full 12 months. I want to thank Craftsy again for sponsoring this video, and with that, we will get back to what I was talking about before. Okay, so the first part of this video that I think will be really helpful for everybody is we're gonna study, if you will, a sweater that I made last year and one that I actually modified quite heavily. This is my Telvinin sweater by Caitlin Hunter. I modified this quite a bit in the process of making it, and I think this sweater really represents well how I like to, one, modify things, and two, how I like to work as a knitter. So we are going to be working from the top down of this sweater, and we're going to go through every single thing that I did to it, why I did it, and whether or not I think the outcome was good or not. Just a quick recap on the sweater itself. This is a top-down yoked design that has a color work yoke, and there was other color work, but we'll get to that in a minute. It's all knit in one piece and it is knit seamless. Right out of the gate, my sweater turned out pretty different than the original design photos, and that was definitely by design. Before I even started knitting on the pattern, I knew there were things about the sweater that I wanted to change. Number one being the neckline. I knew that I didn't want that neckline to be so wide and open on me. It looked to be pretty open on the model in the photo, and then after looking at some of the Ravelry project photos, it appeared to be consistently a pretty wide neckline. So the first thing I did when I cast it on was I just did a folded neckband. I didn't do anything terribly extreme here. All I did was knit, and then I ended up doing essentially a 3-needle bind off method to fold the collar down. The reason I did that opposed to actually stitching it down with a piece of thread at the end is when you knit it down, it tends to leave a bit more stretch in the neckline, and that's something that I wanted. So I wanted something in between having a super structured neckline versus just having it be really open as it was before. And the knitted down folded neckline really was a happy medium for me. The size that I originally cast on for was the size 3. I had done a gauge swatch and my gauge matched, and so I assumed that I would be all hunky-dory with everything about this sweater pretty much. I didn't really expect there to be any fit issues at all. After knitting the neckline, which was a pretty quick mindless modification, I just decided to do this folded over neckband. I ended up doing the short rows, and the short rows I did as written in the pattern. I didn't make any changes there. Went through and knit the entire yoke of this sweater in the size 3. After getting to the try-on point of my yoke before splitting for sleeves, I realized that the fit was way too small. So up to this point, the first time I've knit through the yoke of this sweater, I've only modified the neck, and the entire thing was way too small. It was way too tight on my shoulders. The neckline didn't lay flat because it was essentially being smushed up with tight shoulders, not allowing it to open up fully. At that point, I knew I had to rip back the entire yoke and do some increases. This is where the guessing and modification really comes to life. So I ripped back the entire yoke of this sweater and I had to increase to a size 4. I knew it was small, but I didn't think it was that small. And I was a bit thrown off, right? Because my gauge was correct. I didn't really want to redo a gauge. I didn't know that it would be worth it. And I didn't know that it would even be accurate, considering that the gauge I did was correct. So I just thought, you know, I'll do the size 4 and then knit a little bit, and I should be able to tell if it's gonna fit me. So I ripped back to the point right after I had done the short rows. So I didn't change the short rows at all. I just ripped back the color work portion, and then I did a series of increases to the yoke itself. So I did one more extra row of stockinette to account for my increases. Where this got tricky was I calculated the number of stitches that I would need increased between the 3rd and the 4th size. I think because I didn't redo the short rows, my stitch count was inherently going to be off. And so I ended up having to count how many eagles I was going to have and then just do an increase for each eagle. Because if I just increased the number of stitches that would get me to a size 4, I was going to have uneven spacing between some of these eagles. That was a bit of a fudge, but I didn't want to undo it all, so I just thought, what's a few extra stitches? So all I did on the chart when I was looking at it like on my iPhone was I just added an extra row of stitches on the chart, I think right in front of the nose. So instead of knitting, let's say 1 main color stitch, I knew that I would now always knit 2, or I would always knit 1 extra than the original chart indicated. That put me somewhere right above, I believe, a size 4. Then I just continued knitting. I assumed that that would be enough purely because I think there was about 20 or so eagles, and so I knew that I was going to increase about 20 stitches, and that was going to be probably like 2 to 3 inches bigger, which I felt like would give me the right fit. Again, all guessing. The only math was like the spacing involved. I get through the chart, I get through the yoke, it ends up fitting me really well. I was a bit concerned that it was going to be a bit too big, but I figured I would just roll with it at this point. The next tricky part of this was the sleeve and the body splitting. Essentially what happened here was, because I now am just in no man's land of stitches, I'm not making the size 3, nor am I making exactly the size 4. I had to evenly distribute the extra stitches that I had in order to make each side even and not have any lopsided sleeves. So all I did was take the extra stitches that I had increased and evenly distribute them between the sleeves and then the underarms. I believe, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but all I did was add 6 stitches to each side of the body and then 4 stitches to each arm. That's how I figured out how many underarm stitches to cast on when I was splitting for sleeves. I knew that I didn't want to do any color work on the sleeves or the body at that point, so I didn't have to contend with any type of pattern repeats at that point. I was just doing plain stockinette. But if I did have to contend with pattern repeats, I probably just would have done what I did before and counted how many repeats I would have needed for the stitches that I had, and then increase or decrease depending on like where I was at. So for example, if I needed, let's just say I needed 220 stitches to have an even number of repeats, and the current body after splitting for sleeves only gave me, I don't know, 190. All I personally would have done would have just been to add on a row of increases that gets me to that 200 stitch point on the first row of the body after splitting for sleeves. And that kind of knitting by feel, knitting as I go to make small micro adjustments is how I knit most of the time. I don't like getting too tripped up by things like that because I find that they end up just looking fine. I don't feel that I really ever notice those things. But back to the main point of the sweater. After getting everything split for sleeves, in the original pattern, she has quite a bit of shaping going on. And I think in the original pattern, she gives you the option of increasing your needle size to have a more A-line billowy look and just keeping it the same. I opted for not changing my gauge at all and just doing no shaping on the body. And then I did no shaping on the sleeves as well. So in her pattern, she has some sleeve shaping, and then she also gives you the option and how to for these like subtle balloon sleeves, again with changing the gauge and adjusting how it fits. I just opted for doing the same gauge all over and doing no increases or decreases on the body. So it was just straight tubes. The hem was similar. She had different hems than I did. I just did longer cuffs and I did no color work, and then I believe I did a different bind off method than she did as well. All in all, I think that this sweater really captures my knitting process. I started it ended up not fitting appropriately, even though I did a gauge. Then I just ended up pulling it back, increasing some stitches. At that point, I wasn't really counting stitches in the pattern other than making sure I had enough stitches to have even stitch repeats for the colored yoke portion. But beyond that, I just wanted even stitches. I would reference the size 3 and the size 4 only to see which number I was closer to, and then I would just add or decrease stitches accordingly. And that's really how I got the fit that I got on this sweater. So if I was to quickly recap everything that I did for this, I changed the neckline. I frogged the entire colorwork section after it didn't fit, and then I increased my stitch count for each pattern repeat in order to get me to a bigger size. That put me like somewhere close to the size 4. Oh, and I forgot to mention before, I lengthened the yoke overall. So I finished the chart repeats for the eagles, I tried it on, and then the yoke was still way too short. So I just kept knitting on the yoke until it hit me where I felt like it was comfortable. I unevenly, but evenly, distributed, let's just say 20 extra stitches between the sleeves and the body so that I had even sleeves on either side. I did no shaping on the sleeves or the body, and I removed all extra color work from the bottom portion of the pattern. I also slightly changed the cuff and the hem of the sweater. I think I made mine like much longer than Caitlin did in the original pattern. The punchline of this story is that I had no plan really at all. The only plan I went into with this sweater was that I wanted to change the neckline. I was thinking about not having any color work on the bottom portion of the sweater. I tried it on all the time. And when I say all the time, I really do mean all the time. I think start to finish, I tried this sweater on maybe 6 to 8 separate times, all testing the fit, all to see how it felt. And by far, that has been the number one thing that has, I think, taught me how to get a fit on my body that works for me. Because the patterns can be written well. It has nothing to do with how the patterns are written, but they're inherently not going to be necessarily suited to every single body type. I always have to lengthen the yoke of my sweater. I usually always have to adjust where those increases on my backs and fronts are because I have such a long torso. I also usually have to modify the length somehow. It's always just knitting by feel. I just want to reiterate before we get into the next part of this video that all of the resources I have personally used and really love on modification are linked down below. I take elements and concepts from all of them every single day. And I think if you listen to any of my previous podcasts on knitting recaps and finished garments, you will hear continually, like, I like to modify things and I like to change things. And so much of that I can accredit to hearing how other people do things and just trying it for myself and seeing if I can have a similar result or apply a concept that I've heard to a particular problem that I'm having in my knitting. But the crux of everything, as I said, is trying it on as you go. That for me is what really allows me to make some of these decisions versus if I hadn't tried this sweater on at all in the process and just trusted or assumed that my gauge was correct, I would have gotten all the way through the project without making some of those crucial adjustments. I probably would have ended up with a sweater that I don't like as much. Which brings me to the second part of this video, which is really making a case for guessing. I am a huge proponent of guessing in your knitting as much as possible. Because for me, that is really when I am knitting intuitively versus following the pattern, which isn't always leading me in the right direction. Not because the pattern is written poorly or there's anything wrong with the design, just because it doesn't always work exactly the same for your body type. If the pattern was designed to fit someone who was way tinier than me or significantly larger than me, then the grading might not specifically work for what I like best. And that's totally okay. But it's when I get into this groove of knitting by feel that I really enjoy the process of knitting so much. To illustrate this point further, I want to take a trip down memory lane and talk to you all about my time in culinary school. I don't know if I've told any of you this, but I was a professional chef for 3 years before I got into corporate tech, and I spent like 10 years in hospitality in all different capacities. When I was 21, I attended culinary school in Boulder, Colorado. I like to think of modification in sweaters the same way I think about the two different tracks in culinary school, pastry and cooking. To sum this up, pastry is baking, and it involves very precise, exact measurements. The freaking percentage of humidity in the air can make your cake fall, so you better be on point with your measurements. In the same way that for very precise, complicated, difficult sweater patterns, you'd probably want to be much more exact in your modifications. Cooking is a little bit different. Cooking is, to me, less reliant on preciseness of recipe and much more influenced by the chef themselves. Of course, there's always going to be recipes, and when you're talking about consistency, recipes are going to be your best friend. But back to the main point of this video, I want to illustrate my feelings around modification and guessing and the value that that can potentially bring to you as a knitter by talking about the kinds of students that I identified as two different categories in culinary school. Category one is all the students who always followed the recipe. They rarely experimented. They always followed the recipe exactly. In the short term, they had arguably more success and better outcomes than the second batch of students. Second batch of students were following the recipe, but they were much more free with what they tried. They wouldn't always stick exactly to the recipe. They would sometimes add more salt or more seasoning or less seasoning, or they would, sear things differently. They were just much more experimental in their cooking. In the short term, arguably group one had more success. Group two, tons of failures, tons of things that didn't work out, didn't taste good, things they honestly messed up in their making process that couldn't be fixed because too much salt is just too much salt. And if you were to look at those students purely in the short term, in the beginning of the entire school experience, you would objectively think that group one would become better chefs. But if we zoom out and look at my entire experience, the people who had a much faster rate of growth were the people in group two. Because every failure, every mistake, every guess that didn't pan out led to them asking the question, well, why didn't that work? And I'm not saying that that didn't happen in group one, but I'm talking about the rate at which that happened. Group two tried things all the time. Group one followed the recipe. At the end of the day, at the end of the entire year-long program, one, the people over here enjoyed the process way more. It was more involved. They were more interactive with their cooking. They ended up consistently making better things because the recipe was not always good. A lot of the recipes that we ended up using were very bland. They didn't have a lot of flavor. That, coupled with not the best technique all the time, just made for recipes that weren't that great. And so the more that group two tried things, experimented, over time, more consistently, they had more consistent success in the eyes of the instructors and the people who were critiquing the food that we were making. All of this, I think, relates to not just cooking, but knitting, crochet, really any creative endeavor that one sets themselves on. I truly believe there is so much value in the recipe. The recipe was the starting point for both groups of students, right? But at some point, the bigger question is, well, what if I tried this instead? What if I tried something different? Why do I do it this way? Is this the best way to sear a steak? Is this the way that I personally like to sear a steak? Those same questions for me apply to knitting and everything I do in life. I am always looking for the opportunity of where I can ask, why am I doing this? Why should I do it this way? Arguably, that has resulted in probably more failures. I don't think that I personally produce that many knitted garments. I am constantly ripping things out, starting over, or trying different necklines. My pineapple top that I'm currently working on, I spent an entire evening knitting different necklines. I wasn't happy with it. All for me to eventually decide that I was just gonna knit the neckline later, as I still haven't decided what I want. I think if we go back to the example of the students in cooking school, one of the markers that was really noticeable for the people who were the ones stepping away from the recipe more often and trying more things to see if they could make it better or just try their own thing were the ones who graduated with more confidence. They were the ones who were more comfortable in the kitchen. They enjoyed being in the kitchen more. I'm not saying also that people in group 1 didn't have results like that. Of course, there were some that did. And there's always going to be people that are coming at it at different starting points. My comfort level for not following the rules is arguably too high sometimes. I enjoy drawing outside of the lines. Okay? Not everyone's going to be like that. And that doesn't mean that you can't also be great and or better than people who are kind of always pushing at the boundaries of, well, why am I doing it that way? And do I have to follow these rules? There's pros and cons to both approaches. There's patterns that you need to be precise in. And there's times where you can just guess and you know enough. You as a knitter know enough to try something. You can just say, yeah, I think it'll work out. And go ahead and do it. It doesn't have to be stressful. I hear often people stressing over modifying their sweaters and over the changes that they're making of, well, can I just do some increases here? Or, what's going to happen if this pattern's written in worsted weight yarn and I knit it in DK weight? The truth is, just try sizing down. Just try sizing up if it's written in worsted weight and you want to knit it in DK weight. If your yarn is a bit more extreme, try upping it 2 or 3 sizes. You'll be able to tell pretty quick when trying it on if your method is working or not gonna work. And I think that the minute people take some of that pressure off themselves of it having to be perfect the first time and the fear of having to take the time to undo it and fix it keeps people from wanting to experiment in this way. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think it's a skill and a muscle that you cultivate and exercise. It's certainly not one that I was just born with. I had to work at it and I had to build my comfort level for being wrong and for messing up and for having failures, honestly. And initially they can really be disappointing. And there are still times where even in not just my knitting, but if I make something or at my day job, like it can be anything where, you try things and it doesn't work out. It can be really disappointing. That doesn't necessarily, I think, always get easier. I think that our ability to handle them does get better the more we do it. For me, at least, and this has been consistent in not just my knitting, but everything in my life. I find so much power and learning in just doing. Doing is my greatest teacher. It is the greatest teacher of my life. It has taught me more than any book, any video ever has. And I'm curious what everyone's thoughts are around this, because I hear all the time in this community, there's lots of opinions out there about how to write good patterns and who writes better patterns than others. And I understand wanting to purchase something and have it be written well. But, I have to be honest too. I do think that while yes, it is disappointing and frustrating when sometimes a pattern isn't written to our liking or it's not graded well, or maybe it's not graded at all. Like these are all things that I I understand how frustrating it can be, but I also do think that just like in culinary school, it can be the situation that teaches you so much. We had one day in class where our professor at the time, I forget even what we were doing. We had to put on a banquet or something as a test, and a bunch of kids forgot their recipes. They just didn't bring them. The instructor was like, okay, well, you have to figure it out. You have to figure out how to make that. It was not the best, but it was definitely way better than we thought it would be. The experience taught everyone so much. Everyone was so much more engaged in the process of what we were doing. They were so much more attuned and curious as to why they were even doing this. Why do I add baking soda to a cupcake? It's situations where you have the least amount of information, at least in my experience, that I've had to force myself to learn and adapt to what I need to do to get whatever it is that I'm doing done. I think that there is value to be had in that. I think there is value to not always just blindly following the pattern. And I think that, you know, that's not going to be everyone's jam. Not everyone's going to want to do that, and that's totally okay. But I do think that for me, my whole life, those have been the situations where I've learned the most. And I can confidently look back and say that I now look forward to those moments, because it's those moments of being uncomfortable and even unhappy and frustrated and angry that I am being more reactive and more responsive to what I'm doing. And I know that that is like very, I don't know, maybe that's like too philosophical for how I modify my knitting patterns, but I think for me, it's like a deeper issue, and it's a mindset that I want to take into my life. There's always going to be times and places to be exact, just like in baking. There's going to be patterns where you're going to want to accurately do those math type things to get as close as you can to the right answer. But so far in all the years I have done knitting, I've never personally once needed to do that. I'm gonna keep doing it this way. I really hope to one day be able to just sit down and use my little brain to make a sweater and not need a pattern. That's like what I'm aiming for. I would love to just be able to write patterns for myself one day and come up with an idea, think of it, come up with a gauge swatch, grade it for myself, and then just knit it. Like, how freeing would that be to just be able to produce something that exists in my brain? And with so many resources available now, I know that any problem, you know, is not working for me using this, like just me kind of guessing. I know that there's enough resources out there that I would be able to figure it out. And so that's all I'm gonna say about this. I hope that this was interesting to you. Like I said before, this was definitely not intended to be a like really intricate how-to, because that's just not how I roll. This is just how I like to knit and the reasons behind why I think I get the fit that I want. I think it's a coupling of trying it on constantly. I think that I have tried enough things that didn't work to really give myself quite a bit of perspective on what I know usually works and what I like. This isn't going to be the method that everyone likes. It's not even going to be the method that everyone agrees with, but I think that it's a really interesting conversation. I think that this has applied to not just my knitting, but to all things in my life. And for me, my biggest teacher in life is doing, trying things, failing, honestly. If we were to take a lesson from Edison, 1,000 failures is not a failure. It's just 1,000 ways to not make a light bulb, or whatever that quote was. What a person to look up to in terms of he just didn't give up. He just tried stuff, and he learned arguably more than anyone ever had up to that point about electricity. How cool is that? That could be you. Let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are around this. I'm really curious to hear and read some of the conversation that comes from this. If this is something that you think works for you, if you like to work and knit this way, if you don't, why you don't like to do it. I just am excited to hear and see. I hope that you all enjoyed this and enjoyed my ramblings. It felt a bit rambly, so hopefully that's like fine. I'm gonna sign off for now. I really appreciate everyone being here. I hope you're all getting to make and do all the things that you want to make. It is in the height of spring and I am just thriving. So with that, I'm gonna say bye for now, and I will catch you all on the next one. Bye. Lady. Oh, oh, you choked me. Look. This is my work desk. And so sometimes when I'm feeling emotional, I just have her do this. And she always sits like this every single time. She sits like a little meerkat, and it's because she wants me to scratch her tummy. Ridiculous, look at this face. Okay, all right, bye for now.